Thousands of armed Kurdish fighters just crossed into Iranian territory, and Iranian government forces didn't stand and fight them. They pulled back. An entire border city evacuated by the regime's own troops, and within hours, Kurdish militants were pouring into the mountains behind them, deploying across terrain that Iran's own army had just abandoned. If you haven't been tracking the Kurdish angle of this war, this is the moment you need to understand. Because while most of the coverage of this conflict has been fixated on stealth bombers and bunker buster bombs, there's an entirely separate front that opened up almost immediately once the first strikes landed back in February. And it's a front that Iran genuinely cannot afford to lose control of. So let's break down exactly what happened, why it happened, where it happened, and why this specific uprising cuts closer to the regime's oldest fear than almost anything else in this entire war. To understand why this moment matters so much, you first have to understand who Iran's Kurdish population actually is, and why Tehran has spent decades treating them as an existential threat, rather than just another ethnic minority. Iranian Kurdistan sits along the western edge of the country, bordering Iraq, populated by millions of ethnic Kurds who have their own distinct language, their own cultural identity, and a long, bloody history of armed resistance against the central government in Tehran that stretches back to the earliest days of the Islamic Republic. This isn't a new grievance stirred up overnight by this specific war. Kurdish parties have been fighting a low-intensity insurgency against Iranian forces on and off for decades, what's sometimes referred to as the Western Iran clashes, a conflict that's simmered along that border since at least 2016, and in various forms for far longer than that. So, when this war with the United States and Israel kicked off on February 28th, Iran's Kurdish population wasn't some blank slate waiting to be radicalized. It was a population with organized political parties, trained fighters, mountain bases just across the border in Iraq, and decades of accumulated motivation, sitting there, watching Tehran suddenly get hit with the most devastating military campaign in the regime's entire history. And here's the thing that made this moment different from every previous flare-up in that decades-long conflict. Just 6 days before the war even started, on February 22nd, 5 of the major Iranian Kurdish opposition parties formally announced they were joining forces. The Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan, the Kurdistan Freedom Party, the Kurdistan Free Life Party, the Organization of Iranian Kurdistan Struggle, and the Kamala of the Toilers of Kurdistan came together under a single unified banner called the Coalition of Political Forces of Iranian Kurdistan. A sixth group, the Kamala Party of Iranian Kurdistan, joined shortly after. For decades, one of the biggest reasons Iran's Kurdish opposition never posed a truly existential threat to Tehran was fragmentation, competing parties, competing leaders, competing visions for what an autonomous or independent Kurdistan should even look like, all of it bleeding away the kind of unified strength that might actually challenge the regime. Suddenly, on the eve of the biggest war Iran had fought in decades, that fragmentation disappeared, replaced by a single coalition with one explicit stated goal: toppling the Islamic Republic and achieving Kurdish self-determination inside Iran's own borders. That timing was not a coincidence, and it's worth understanding exactly why. This coalition didn't form in a vacuum. It formed directly on the back of the massive nationwide protest movement that had already been rocking Iran throughout 2025 and into early 2026, protests that Kurdish cities and provinces had participated in with particular intensity. Observing general strikes across Kermanshah, Kurdistan province, and West Azerbaijan that were called for by these exact same Kurdish parties. So by the time American and Israeli strikes began pounding Tehran's military and political leadership, Iran's Kurdish population was already primed, already politically mobilized, already organizationally unified in a way it hadn't been in decades, and now watching the regime they'd been fighting on and off for generations suddenly get hit with the kind of blow that made toppling it look, for the first time in a long time, genuinely possible. Within hours of the war actually beginning, representatives from this new Kurdish coalition announced that their forces were already jointly coordinating political and military decisions, and that fighters were positioned deep inside Iran itself and along the entire Iran-Iraq border, ready to respond as the situation developed. That's an incredibly fast mobilization for a coalition that had only formally existed for less than a week, and it tells you something important about how much groundwork had already been quietly laid before that coalition was even publicly announced. By March 2nd, just 2 days into the war, a coalition of political forces of Iranian Kurdistan official told the Israeli outlet I-24 News that fighters from the Kurdistan Free Life Party, known as PJAK, had begun taking actual combat positions inside Iranian territory. And then came the detail that really matters for understanding this specific title. Iranian forces withdrew from the border city of Marwan the very next day, and thousands of PJAK fighters deployed straight into the Zagros Mountains behind them. The same rugged, defensible terrain that Kurdish insurgents have used as a natural fortress against the Iranian military for generations. A United States official actually confirmed that report directly to Fox News, which tells you this wasn't just Kurdish factions inflating their own press releases. American officials were tracking this closely enough and taking it seriously enough to put their own credibility behind confirming it. Now, at almost the exact same moment, over in the Kirkuk-Erbil corridor, a separate Kurdish faction called the Kurdistan Freedom Party, widely regarded as the most militarily active and battle-tested of the various Kurdish groups, given its history training alongside American forces during the campaign against ISIS, was also repositioning. When the President of the United States is personally getting on the phone with Kurdish opposition leaders within the opening days of a war, that tells you exactly how seriously Washington was weighing the Kurdish uprising as a genuine strategic lever against Tehran, not just a sideshow happening on the margins of the main conflict. So let's talk about why Iran reacted the way it did, because the regime's response tells you everything about how seriously Tehran actually took this threat, arguably more seriously than it treated some of the conventional military pressure coming from American airstrikes. Rather than waiting to see how this Kurdish mobilization played out, Iranian forces moved preemptively and moved fast. On March 1st and 2nd, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps launched missile and drone strikes directly against Kurdish party positions inside Iraq's own Kurdistan region, technically a separate sovereign country, hitting Kurdistan Freedom Party bases in Erbil and killing at least one fighter in those opening strikes. The Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan reported its own bases between Erbil and Duhok were struck by ballistic missiles and drones during that same window. Think about the strategic calculation embedded in that decision. Iran, in the opening days of an already overwhelming war against the most powerful military coalition it had ever faced, chose to divert missiles and drones towards striking Kurdish opposition camps inside a neighboring country, rather than conserving every single one of those weapons for the fight against American and Israeli forces. That's not a rational allocation of scarce military resources unless you genuinely believe the threat you're diverting resources to address is close to existential. And Iran didn't stop at airstrikes either. Tehran issued an explicit threat, warning that it would target, in its own words, all the facilities of the Kurdistan region of Iraq if Kurdish militants were allowed to enter Iran from Iraqi territory. That's a direct threat against an entire semi-autonomous region of a neighboring sovereign country, essentially telling the Kurdistan regional government in Erbil that hosting these opposition parties, something it had already been doing for years, would now be treated as an act of war, deserving a response against the region's own infrastructure. That kind of threat only makes sense if you understand just how much Iran's Kurdish population represents a uniquely dangerous vulnerability compared to protests happening elsewhere in the country. A demonstration in Tehran is a domestic unrest problem the regime has decades of practice managing through mass arrests and internet blackouts. An armed, organized, externally supported Kurdish uprising along a porous mountain border, with thousands of trained fighters already positioned inside Iranian territory and a unified political coalition behind them, is a territorial integrity problem entirely, the kind of threat that touches the regime's oldest and deepest anxiety about the country, fracturing along ethnic lines, the way it very nearly did in the chaotic years immediately following the 1979 revolution. Now, I want to give you the honesty check here, because this is a story where the actual scale of what happened has genuinely been contested, and it's worth walking through that contestation carefully rather than just repeating the most dramatic version of events. On March 4th, several American media outlets reported that a full Kurdish-led ground offensive had officially begun, with the Israeli outlet I-24 News specifically describing PJAK fighters moving into positions around the southern mountains near Merivan. But notably, no footage accompanied that specific report, and the official cited by name was actually left unnamed in the reporting. The very next day, on March 5th, PJAK, the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan, the Kurdistan Freedom Party, and Kamala all issued statements specifically denying that a formal Kurdish offensive inside Iran had actually started. Aziz Ahmed, an official with the Kurdistan region of Iraq's own government, went even further, stating flatly that not a single Iraqi Kurd had crossed the border. So you have a genuine, documented contradiction sitting right at the center of this story. American and Israeli outlets initially reporting a full-scale offensive, and the Kurdish parties themselves, along with regional government officials, pushing back and denying that characterization within 24 hours. How do you reconcile that contradiction? The most balanced assessment, drawn from multiple analysts who've tracked this closely since March, is that the reality sat somewhere in between the most dramatic initial headlines and the flat denials that followed. What actually appears to have happened is advanced positioning and limited infiltration, fighters genuinely moving into forward positions, genuinely crossing into Iranian border territory in meaningful numbers in specific pockets like the area around Marwan, but not the kind of large-scale, coordinated multi-front military offensive that the initial breathless headlines suggested. That distinction matters enormously because it's the difference between a full-blown Kurdish uprising actively contesting Iranian territory in a conventional military sense and a serious, credible, externally supported mobilization that was real, was significant, and genuinely worried Tehran enough to divert missiles toward it without necessarily amounting to the kind of full-scale liberation of Iranian Kurdistan that some of the earliest reporting implied. And there's a reason for that gap between ambition and outcome, one that has everything to do with geopolitics well beyond just Iran and its own Kurdish population. Reporting has consistently pointed to a specific factor that ultimately prevented the broader, coordinated Kurdish offensive from fully materializing the way American and Israeli planners initially hoped: opposition from Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. That might seem like an odd name to show up in a story about Iranian Kurds, but it makes complete sense once you understand the regional context. Turkey has its own decades-long, deeply fraught relationship with Kurdish separatism, having fought its own long-running insurgency against Kurdish militant groups within its own borders for generations. Ankara has never wanted to see a strong, unified, internationally backed Kurdish political and military movement take shape anywhere near its borders, out of legitimate fear that success for Iranian Kurds could inspire and embolden Kurdish populations inside Turkey itself or inside Syria and Iraq, potentially reshaping the entire regional balance of Kurdish nationalism in ways Ankara has spent decades trying to prevent. So even as Washington was actively negotiating with Kurdish factions, and even as Trump was personally getting on the phone with their leaders, Turkey's objections appear to have meaningfully constrained just how far that support was ultimately allowed to go, part of why Trump's own posture reportedly shifted rapidly within just a week of the war beginning, according to analysts tracking the diplomatic back and forth in real time. Abdullah Muhtadi leads the Kamala Party of Iranian Kurdistan, representing a more explicitly left-leaning strand of Kurdish nationalist politics with its own long history of armed resistance against Tehran, going back decades. When you put those specific leaders and their specific organizational histories together, what you're looking at isn't some spontaneous eruption of anger. It's a coalition built from decades of accumulated organizational experience, waiting for exactly the kind of moment that this war against Tehran finally provided. There's also a broader regional dimension worth understanding, because Iran's Kurdish population isn't operating in isolation from Kurdish movements elsewhere in the region, and that interconnectedness is precisely what makes Tehran and Ankara so nervous about any sign of Kurdish success anywhere nearby. Kurdish populations span across 4 countries in total: Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Syria, each with their own distinct political movements, their own armed factions, and their own complicated, often tense relationships with each other. Iraq's Kurdistan region has enjoyed genuine autonomy for decades now, complete with its own government, its own security forces, and its own economy, making it the closest thing the broader Kurdish nationalist movement has to a proof of concept that Kurdish self-governance can actually work in practice. That's exactly why Iranian Kurdish opposition parties have been able to base themselves across the border in Iraqi territory for so long, operating in relative safety under the protection of a fellow Kurdish government, even as they continue actively working to undermine Tehran. And it's exactly why any sign of a serious, successful Kurdish push inside Iran carries weight far beyond Iran's own borders, because a meaningful Kurdish territorial or political win against one of the region's major powers would inevitably ripple outward, reshaping how Kurdish populations and governments in Iraq, Syria, and Turkey all calculate their own future prospects. That regional web is also exactly why Turkey's objections carried enough weight to meaningfully constrain how far American and Israeli support for this uprising was ultimately allowed to go. Erdogan's government has spent years conducting its own military operations against Kurdish militant groups operating from northern Iraq and northern Syria. And the last thing Ankara wanted to see was Washington actively arming and coordinating with a different set of Kurdish factions, just across another border, even if those specific factions were nominally focused on Iran rather than Turkey. From Erdogan's perspective, any precedent of the United States treating Kurdish nationalist movements as legitimate strategic partners worth empowering carries risk, regardless of which specific government those Kurdish fighters happen to be targeting in any given moment. That tension between Washington's short-term interest in using Kurdish fighters to pressure Tehran and its longer-term relationship with Turkey, a NATO ally that has made its own red lines on this exact issue extremely clear over many years, is a big part of why the full-scale offensive that some early March headlines described never quite materialized into the kind of sustained, large-scale military campaign it initially appeared to be heading toward. Because even a limited partial mobilization carries real strategic weight in a conflict like this one. Even without a full territorial offensive, the mere existence of thousands of mobilized, coordinated Kurdish fighters positioned along Iran's western border, backed by a unified political coalition and openly courted by both Washington and allegedly by Israeli intelligence services, forced Tehran to make a series of costly choices it otherwise wouldn't have had to make. It forced the regime to divert missiles and drones away from the primary fight against American and Israeli forces and towards striking Kurdish camps in a neighboring country instead. It forced Iranian military planners to keep meaningful troop presence tied down along an already unstable western border, rather than concentrating every available unit against the far more conventional threats coming from the air and from the Gulf. And it forced the regime to publicly threaten an entire semi-autonomous region of a neighboring sovereign state, a threat that, if ever acted on its scale, risked dragging Iraq's Kurdistan regional government, and by extension, potentially the broader government in Baghdad, into direct conflict with Tehran as well. None of that shows up as dramatically on camera as a bunker buster bomb hitting a mountain, but strategically, it's exactly the kind of pressure that stretches an already overwhelmed military even thinner. There's also a longer running pattern here worth understanding, because Iran's fear of its Kurdish population isn't just about this specific war. It's rooted in genuine historical precedent. In the immediate chaos following the 1979 revolution, Iranian Kurdistan actually did briefly establish something close to autonomous control in parts of the region, before the new Islamic Republic's military eventually reasserted control through a brutal, protracted campaign. That history is exactly why Tehran has spent decades treating any sign of organized Kurdish political or military mobilization with a level of paranoia and preemptive violence that often exceeds how it treats unrest in other parts of the country. When Iranian state media covers protests in Tehran, the framing tends to focus on economic grievances or foreign interference. When Iranian state media covers Kurdish mobilization, the framing almost always pivots quickly towards separatism and territorial integrity. Because in the institutional memory of the regime, Kurdish unrest has always carried the added, uniquely threatening possibility of the country actually fracturing, rather than simply the government being replaced. So let's fast forward and look at where this Kurdish front actually stands today, because the picture has evolved considerably since those chaotic opening days back in March. On June 17th, Iran and the United States signed a memorandum of understanding aimed at ending hostilities, a formal ceasefire framework that, as we've discussed in other breakdowns of this war, has proven considerably shakier in practice than it looked on paper. But even with that broader ceasefire nominally in place, Iran never actually stopped treating its Kurdish opposition as an active threat. According to analysis published by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in early July, Iran had by that point carried out hundreds of separate drone and missile strikes against exiled Iranian Kurdish militant groups, still based across the border in Iraqi Kurdistan throughout the course of the war. Strikes that had killed at least 10 of their members. Hundreds of strikes against a single ethnic opposition movement, sustained across months of fighting, even as broader diplomatic negotiations were unfolding elsewhere. That's not the behavior of a regime that views this specific threat as a minor sideshow. That's the behavior of a regime that considers its Kurdish opposition dangerous enough to keep expending scarce military resources against it, month after month, regardless of what else is happening on the diplomatic front. And that same Carnegie analysis captured something important about where Kurdish opposition groups themselves stand today, months removed from those initial dramatic headlines about a ground offensive. Dissident Iranian Kurds, the analysis noted, are facing increased scrutiny from Tehran, and Kurdish rebel groups are described as being genuinely wary of what the regime's next move against them might be. That wariness makes complete sense given everything we've just walked through. These groups spent the opening weeks of this war being courted directly by the CIA, by President Trump personally, by Israeli intelligence services, all of it dangling the possibility of meaningful international backing for a Kurdish uprising that might finally succeed where decades of previous attempts had failed. And then, within roughly a week, that support appeared to meaningfully soften, partly due to Turkish pressure, even as Iran continued, and by some accounts intensified, its campaign of strikes against exactly the same Kurdish factions that had briefly been positioned as key partners in toppling the regime. That's an incredibly precarious position to be left in, having demonstrated your willingness and your capability to fight, having drawn the regime's sustained retaliatory fire as a direct result, and then watching the international backing that encouraged you to take that risk in the first place become considerably less certain than it looked in the opening days of the war. There's one more piece of this worth sitting with, because it speaks to just how personal this conflict has become for ordinary Kurdish civilians caught in the middle of it, not just the armed fighters making headlines. The strikes Iran launched against Kurdish party bases in Erbil and Duhok didn't happen in some remote, unpopulated stretch of desert. They happened near populated Kurdish communities inside Iraq that have hosted Iranian Kurdish refugees and opposition activists for generations, families who fled Iranian government crackdowns decades ago and built entire lives in exile just across the border, always aware that Tehran's reach could extend across that line whenever it decided the political cost of doing so was worth paying. When Iranian missiles started landing near those same communities in the opening days of this war, It wasn't just a military escalation. It was a direct message to an entire diaspora that had spent decades believing that physical distance from Iran offered at least some measure of protection. A message that, this time, it didn't. Honey, because it's worth understanding the real scale of what Iran's Kurdish opposition can actually field, especially compared to the country's overall military. Congressional Research Service, reporting from early March, estimated that Kurdistan region-based Iranian Kurdish factions, taken together across all the various parties, have somewhere around 2,500 fighters under arms in total, though other assessments suggested the various groups may have sent hundreds more into Iranian territory during those opening weeks of mobilization. Compare that to Iran's own conventional military, which by other estimates fields several 100,000 active duty personnel and hundreds of thousands more in reserve. An enormous conventional force built primarily to deter or fight a war against neighboring states, or a coalition like the one it's currently facing from the United States and Israel, not to permanently garrison a mountainous internal border against an insurgency it already knows intimately from decades of prior experience. On paper, that's an enormously lopsided fight, a few thousand irregular fighters against one of the largest standing militaries in the Middle East. But raw numbers have never told the full story when it comes to insurgencies fought in mountainous, defensible terrain by fighters who know that ground intimately and have spent decades practicing exactly this kind of asymmetric warfare against a much larger conventional force. The Zagros Mountains aren't just scenic backdrop. They're some of the most difficult terrain in the entire region to sustain conventional military operations against a dug-in, mobile insurgent force, which is exactly why Iran has never managed to fully stamp out Kurdish resistance in that region, across more than 4 decades of trying, despite throwing vastly superior numbers and firepower at the problem, generation after generation. If you're finding this kind of deep dive genuinely useful, actually understanding the full range of internal pressures Iran has been juggling throughout this war, rather than just the headline strikes making the evening news each night, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because the Kurdish front is genuinely one of the most underreported and underexplained threads in this entire conflict. And there's a lot more still developing as this plays out in the months ahead. And if you've got questions about any of the specific Kurdish factions we've talked about here, how they differ from each other politically, or how this compares to other Kurdish movements across the region in Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, drop them in the comments, because this is genuinely one of the more complicated threads of this war, and it deserves a closer look. So let's zoom out and think about what this Kurdish mobilization actually tells us about the broader trajectory of this war going forward. Even if the full-scale offensive some early reports described never fully materialized, the underlying dynamics that made it possible in the first place haven't gone anywhere. The unified coalition still exists. The thousands of fighters who deployed into the Zagros Mountains in those opening days are, by most accounts, still positioned there or nearby. The historical grievances, the decades of suppressed autonomy, the memory of that brief post-revolutionary period of self-governance, none of that fades just because a ceasefire memorandum got signed between Washington and Tehran in June. What's actually changed is the level of active, coordinated international backing pushing, that mobilization towards something bigger, support that flared intensely in the opening days of the war and has, by most recent accounts, cooled considerably since, even as Iran's own campaign against these groups has continued largely uninterrupted. That combination, still armed, still organized, still deeply motivated Kurdish opposition, facing a regime that continues actively targeting it without the same level of international backing that briefly made a genuine breakthrough look possible, is exactly the kind of unresolved tension that tends not to simply disappear on its own. It's the kind of situation that can remain simmering for months or years, flaring back up dramatically the moment either side sees a fresh opportunity, whether that's Iran's regime facing another moment of catastrophic weakness the way it did back in February, or Kurdish factions finding a renewed source of outside support if this broader war with the United States and Israel ever reignites at the scale it reached in its opening weeks. Either way, anyone trying to understand the full picture of what's actually happening inside Iran right now, not just the airstrikes and the naval blockades making headlines, but the deeper fractures running underneath the entire country, has to account for the fact that thousands of armed Kurdish fighters are still sitting in those mountains, still organized under a coalition that's explicitly committed to toppling the regime, still watching closely for the next opportunity, and still representing exactly the kind of existential territorial threat that Tehran has spent more than 4 decades trying, and repeatedly failing, to permanently extinguish.